So radio waves, as you will see, is just incredibly fun to play with. It's a great filter for generating specific effects, but also a great filter for doing interesting geometric backgrounds and such. We're going to start in the radio waves intro composition that I have open here on screen, and all we're looking at is a black solid. Radio wave is not a filter that you apply to a movie layer, etc. Radio wave wants to be applied to its own layer. It applies to a solid that should be layered above the layer that you want to composite things with if you want to add a radio wave effect to a scene. So radio wave needs its own solid. So now that we've selected our radio waves layer, we'll go up to Effect and choose Render Radio Waves. You jump back to frame 0 and hitting the space bar will pretty quickly explain exactly what's going on here. Radio waves emits concentric circles by default from an effect point. And that effect point, which we call a producer point, is located by default in the center of the screen. We can obviously click and drag that anywhere on screen that we want to, and that's where the waves will be emanated from that point forward. Let me move it just a little bit off center left. That's good. So let's just tour through the various settings that are available to us. We'll come back to this first one. Parameters are set at either birth or each frame. We'll talk about what that means in just a second. Render quality, 4 is a nice default setting. You're not going to need to mess with this setting very much, but if you wanted a rougher radio wave, you could try cranking your render quality way down and your line would start to break up, but most people don't want to work that way. 4 is a nice compromise between speed and quality. If you find that this line is not high quality enough for you, you could try a higher value. The wave type, by default, is polygon, and that's what most of our first controls are that we're going to be looking at. Your other choices in here are image contours and a mask. We'll talk about a mask in the very next composition. Image contours is kind of a holdover from the very first version of radio waves when you were able to look at the luminance values of a layer and determine a shape based on the luminance values. While it still has some uses, it's such a challenging way to work that I don't really recommend it. I think in almost all cases, you're going to be doing better to work with a mask. So we're just going to focus on the mask controls and the polygon controls for this lesson. So keeping polygon set, let's twirl open our polygon settings and see that what looks like a circle is in fact just a multi-sided polygon. It has 64 sides. That gives us a nice representation of a circle without any hint that we're really looking at a whole bunch of straight sides. But as I click and drag this to the left, you'll see the resolution slowly begin to go down. You can definitely see sides now at about 13, 12, 11, 10, 9, 8, and you end up at 3. 3 is the fewest sides that a polygon can have. You can't have a two-sided polygon, so the lowest value of 3 gives us triangles emanating out from the center. We'll leave it set to that for just a second. The next two controls, curve size and curviness, have to do with rounding off the edges of our polygons. Curve size has to do with the smoothness of the curve, and curviness has to do with how far into the line of the polygon does the curve actually eat into it. So adjust these until you get the results that you like if what you're going for is a smooth polygon. I'm going to keep things sharp. And underneath the curviness setting, there's a switch to toggle on a star. And when we turn on star, another control becomes available for us, which is star depth. Let me set our sides up to 5. This gives us a traditional star, and by adjusting the star depth, you can see that you can have a very shallow star or a very deep star, which gives us really a pointy effect. So you can already see that just with some of these basic polygon settings, you can come up with some pretty cool stuff. Let's turn our star back off again and just work with a polygon. Crank it back down to 3 again. And let's move down to our wave motion settings. Under wave motion, we have frequency. That's the times per second that a wave is emitted. Right now, it's set to 1 wave per second, so every second a new triangle comes out. This should be pretty obvious to figure out. When you crank it up, you get more polygons on screen, so a higher value results in more polygons. Very nice, very cool. Expansion is the speed in which polygons expand, so a higher value will not only increase the distance between the polygons, but will also make them move off-screen faster from the time that they're born. Okay. Orientation is really easy to see with a shape like a triangle. Orientation basically deals with the starting angle of the shape. A triangle with an orientation of 0 points off to the right. If we wanted to have a flat bottom triangle, we would adjust the orientation until the bottom went flat like that, and it would just basically live like that for the rest of its life. Now direction, if you crank this around, doesn't seem to do much of anything. So you might think that it's broken. In fact, you might be looking at direction thinking that that would be adjusting the orientation, but it's not. Direction is set by default to 90, and it works in conjunction with the velocity controls. I'm going to go back up and select the title of our effect here so that we get our effect controls back. And I'm going to move the effect control off to the left-hand side of the window here, and I'm going to scroll back down again, and I'm going to crank up our velocity value and watch what happens to the triangles. They start shifting off to the right. Well, if we twirl open our direction, you'll see that our direction is set to the right, and with the velocity set to the right, in effect, when the particles are born, they're spit out to the right instead of concentrically around the center of our layer. You can change the direction by just adjusting the direction slider around to send particles off anywhere that you like. That looks pretty cool. And adjust the velocity accordingly. And of course, the expansion works in conjunction with that as well to fine-tune an effect to get exactly what you need. Okay, let's take our velocity back down to 0 again. And we'll drag our producer point a little closer to the center. And let's look at the lifespan controls. Cranking down the lifespan basically allows the polygons to fade out after a certain period of time. A 2-second lifespan means at the end of 2 seconds, these polygons will fade out. All right? Now, these work in conjunction with a couple of other controls I'll talk about in just a second. The last element that's on here that's worth mentioning is reflection, and I'll need to turn my lifespan back up again to a higher value to see exactly what that does. If I turn on reflection, watch what happens to these polygons as they reach the edge of the layer. They bounce back in again. Very, very cool. And all of a sudden you can create some really interesting geometric stuff with very little effort just by taking a polygon and having it create reflections. Now look how drastically the look of this will change just by changing the number of sides in our polygon back up to its default value of 64. Boom. Now we have a completely different look from the triangle shape that we had before. Equally interesting, but completely different. Now lastly, at the bottom, we have the stroke controls. Let me jump back home again. Let me move forward a bit so we have just a few elements on screen. And let me take a look at our stroke controls. Now we're going to bounce around the controls in here a little bit because the first ones will make more sense if we adjust the last ones first. I'm going to crank up my start width to something much higher so we see fatter lines on screen. And with these fat lines on screen, we can see the difference between a square profile, which gives us a solid line, a triangular profile, which fades from nothing up to solid and back to nothing again. You can check the alpha channel as well to see that we're generating an alpha mask that coincides with that fade value. Sawtooth out gives us a hard edge on one side, fading out. Sawtooth in gives us a hard edge on the outside that fades in. I really love this look. This is great for Looney Tune type backgrounds, etc. Looks really, really nice. I'm going to turn off reflections right now. Gaussian is a blurred square line. And then there's bell curve and a sine curve. Both of these are extremely useful for creating displacement maps, but otherwise result in a softer wave than what I'm usually going for when I'm creating these kinds of geometric designs. So for the time being, let me set things back to sawtooth in. That's a nice wave to work with. Opacity adjusts the maximum opacity of the particles in their lifetime. If we get a bunch of them on screen, we can now take a look at the lifespan again and adjust that lifespan down so that you can see the particles fading out. I keep calling them particles because this is a particle system. I'll explain that a little bit more in just a second. But the polygons, or particles, are fading out now over just a couple of seconds, out to about nothing. But the fade out time is currently set to 5 seconds. If I crank that way down to like 1 second, then the polygons will stay fully opaque halfway through their lifespan and then only fade out in the last second of their lifespan. Fade in time, on the other hand, allows you to actually let the polygons ease into their life by fading in, and then they'll peak somewhere around here, and then they'll fade back out again. So most of these controls are pretty easy to understand. But as I hinted at a second ago, this is a particle system. This is not just a system that generates expanding circles. It's a full-blown particle system. Let me reset our controls here and talk about exactly what that means. What we haven't really discussed about playing with all of these controls is that almost everything in here can be animated. So if we give ourselves circles, we crank up our frequency to a good-sized amount, set a keyframe for our producer point back at frame 0. I hit the home key to go to frame 0. And now let's shift page down a couple of times to get over to 1 second, and watch what happens now when I move our producer point. Ooh, shift page down 3 more times, move it down here, shift page down 3 more times, move over here, shift page down 3 more times, move up here, shift page down a few more times. I'm just dragging this effect point all over screen to prove the point that this is a particle system. It leaves particles behind when it moves around. That is, as long as you have parameters are set at birth. If we change that to each frame, then you get a different effect. You get emitting sound waves, but they follow the effect point around. This has its uses, but it's nowhere near as interesting as keeping the parameters set at birth. So we're going to do that. I'm going to crank up my frequency even a little higher to increase the density between my polygons. Let's talk about some of the other cool things we can set. Let's give ourselves a fatter start width, an even fatter end width. Let's make our wave profile sawtooth in. Let's crank our maximum opacity down so that the waves blend with each other. And let's give ourselves a lifespan of about 4 seconds so that things will fade out as we go. Starting to look pretty cool. And now let's talk about some of the other things that we can animate. First, though, let's take our sides down to something like 4, where we have a very definite shape that we can see. We've got diamonds moving along here. That's cool. Now, if we go down and adjust our spin value, as opposed to orientation, which sets the initial angle of the polygons when they're born, spin sets a value at which the elements spin after they're born. So cranking this value up creates tumbling, spinning polygons, which can be very cool. And one of my favorite things to do at this point is animate the color. So let's jump home and set a keyframe for color. Let me hit the U key so that we can actually see our color down here in the timeline. I'm going to move my timeline up just a bit so it's easily visible on screen. And I'm going to hit Shift Page Down just to go forward 10 frames. And let's pick another color. Let's pick green. Click OK. Hit Shift Page Down. Let me bring this down where we can see it a little better. We'll pick another color. Let's choose a saturated red this time. Hit Enter. Shift Page Down one more time. Bring it back where we can see it. And let's come around to, maybe a magenta. That's good. Shift Page Down. Color chip again. And let's choose cyan. Click OK. Shift Page Down. Color chip one more time. And let's pick yellow. We've made it through most of the primary colors now. So we'll click OK. Select all these colors. Copy. Jump out to 2 seconds. And paste. Jump out to 4 seconds. And paste. 6 seconds and paste. 8 seconds and paste. And now we have just created some really fun animations here. You see, after we generate a quick RAM preview, that really, with very little effort, we've created a really, really interesting multicolored background. So let's see what else we can do with this filter and this approach. The animated color is so great that I'm just going to leave it. But before I do, I want to show you one thing that's really cool that we probably haven't seen just yet. And that is if we twirl open the color value, After Effects actually gives us a readout here in the timeline of the various colors that we move through, which is really, really cool. I love that. Just one of those things I like to point out that people don't typically discover on their own. I'm also going to change our background color with our keyboard shortcut, which is Control-Shift-B on Windows, Command-Shift-B on the Mac. And I'll bring up our color picker and just pick white. Let's do a white background, I think. So we got a nice pastel thing going on here now, which is a little prettier to my eye than what we had before. And the next thing I'm going to do is actually get rid of our animated effect point. Let's take things back to frame 0, go back to my radio waves effect, select the effect point and drag it back to the center. And now I'm going to use something that we haven't used very much, and I'm not even really talking about it in any great detail until the next set. And that is an expression. But expressions are so fundamentally cool and so wonderful to use that I'm actually going to break one out now and give you a taste of some of the things to come. I'm going to hold down the Alt key on Windows, the Option key on the Mac, and we'll click on the stopwatch for the effect point, and that will enable an expression for the effect point. And the expression we're going to type in is very simple. I'm going to type in wiggle. I'm going to open parentheses, and I'm going to tell it how many wiggles per second that I want. I want a lot, so let's do like 15. And what is the amount of the wiggle? I want my producer point to go all over screen. So I'm going to say something like 300. Close parentheses, hit Enter on the numeric keypad, and now we've generated random producer point for our various waves. Isn't that cool? Now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to randomize the start rotation for all of these pieces. And I'm going to do that by going to my orientation setting. I'm going to set a keyframe for that just long enough to hit the U key and reveal the property here in the timeline. Then I can delete that keyframe. Once again, hold the Alt key down and enable an expression now for orientation. And I'm going to type in random parentheses 360 close parentheses. This will generate a random value between 0 and 360 degrees. So each single particle that will be born will now be born at a random orientation, pointing every which way. They'll all continue to spin in the direction that I set. I'm going to use yet another cool expression. I'm going to go back to our wave motion settings, and I'm going to turn on a keyframe for spin. Once again, type the U key a couple of times to see our spin controls. And I'm going to enable an expression for spin. And we can't quite see it down there, so I'm going to move my timeline up a little bit higher. And this time our expression is going to be very slightly more complicated. I need to generate random values between negative 360 and positive 360. The simplest way I know to do that is just type in random 720, which is the range of numbers that we need to create, and then subtract 360 from the results that we get, and that should give us values between minus 360 and positive 360. I'll hit Enter, and now each of our resulting polygons will be spinning in a different direction and at a different speed. Very, very cool. The last little bit of fine-tuning I'll do to this will be visual. Let's go back down to our stroke controls and switch things back to square. So we have nice solid polygons on screen. I'll crank up my start width, crank up my end width, crank down my opacity so that the colors blend together very nicely. Generate a quick RAM preview and show you once again, with really not that much effort, a few little tricks, we've generated a really interesting geometric background. You'd never know that this was generated with a plugin called Radio Waves. I mean, it doesn't look anything like a radiating wave style animation. This looks really chaotic and graphic and wonderful, I think. Love this effect. But Radio Waves is not only good for generating these kinds of abstract mod, op art, pop effects, it is also good for creating realistic effects. But before we leap off and do a realistic effect, I want to show you one last thing with this particular project, and that is how well a plugin like Colorama works in conjunction with the kind of an effect that we've created right now. Once again, Colorama is a great way to colorize things like what we've just created. So following what we learned in the last module, First of all, I don't want to modify my alpha channel, so we'll just be modifying the color of the pixels, not the transparency of the pixels. But you can pick all sorts of different output cycles and see what you come up with. Really interesting color combinations. Experiment, play, see what kind of stuff that you can come up with just by combining radio wave and colorama together. I think you'll really like the results. But let's close this particular composition down and move on to the next composition, which is the smoke composition. And I'm going to use this to tackle two topics. One topic is using custom shapes to emanate from our producer point, not just polygons, but also creating a sort of realistic effect, although we don't actually have a photorealistic train here or photorealistic poles going by, and you probably wouldn't be able to see a light beam in broad daylight like we have here, but nonetheless, we're going to create some nice looking smoke to go along with this train. Let's turn on our smoke layer. In fact, let's solo our smoke layer. And I'm even going to make our other layers shy so we don't have to see anything else in the timeline for now except our smoke layer. So we're just going to concentrate on this layer. This layer has a mask applied to it. It's in the shape of a kind of a cartoon cloud. You could make a more detailed cloud if you want to, but for our purposes, this is going to work fine. And to this, we're going to apply Effect, Render, Radio Waves. Tap the space bar and you'll see we've got our default settings. We've got a circle generated from our radio waves. But if instead we change it from polygon to mask, you'll see, aha, our shape doesn't look like a circle anymore. It looks like the mask that is drawn on this layer. And we can use this to great effect. This is just a wonderful, wonderful way to work. What we're going to do with this now is we're going to create realistic smoke. And we're going to create it using a couple of tricks that we've seen already. The first thing that we want to do is we want to go to our wave motion settings and crank up our frequency. We're going to need a lot more of these clouds than we have on screen right now. Let's crank it up to a value of about 10. We'll adjust from there. Our expansion, we could probably even crank down a bit to something like 3, so we get fairly slow growth. And for direction, we're going to have the smoke move up by setting the direction value to 0 and give ourselves a velocity that will actually make the smoke move upwards on the screen. Okay? We're also going to want our smoke to kind of be tumbling, so we'll set a spin value of -80 or so, which is pretty good. And let's go deal with our stroke. Open up our stroke controls. We obviously don't want blue smoke, so we'll pick just a light gray. That's pretty good. Our start width and end width will need to crank up much higher than they currently are. And already that gives us a nice smoke edge, but that's not really what we're going for. We want to pick sawtooth in, and that'll give us softer edges, and crank our opacity way, way down. And that's starting to give us a nice billowy smoke effect that's pretty good. We do have this kind of regularity going on, though. You can sort of see these repeating patterns in here, and we want to get rid of those repeating patterns. And the easiest way to do it is to randomize the orientation of the layer. So we're going to go back to our wave motion, and for orientation, set a quick keyframe just long enough to hit the U key and solo it down here in the timeline. Then we can select that keyframe and get rid of it. Hold down the Alt key on Windows, Option key on Mac, and that enables an expression for the layer. And we're going to type in random 360. That'll generate a random value between 0 and 360. And oops, I didn't get an open parentheses. I accidentally entered an open bracket. So now I've got 2 parentheses in there. This should work just fine. And we've got smoke randomly oriented with each individual particle, each individual shape. And you can see it looks much, much more realistic. I crank down my expansion value even more so it doesn't billow out quite so much. Also going to take my velocity down somewhat so it doesn't move all that fast. And lastly, to make the effect look a little more realistic, I'm going to apply Effect, Blur and Sharpen, Fast Blur, and just adjust the blurriness value up a little bit, turning on Repeat Edge Pixels so we don't get that little bit of ghosting along the top. That's probably too much. We probably don't need more than 4 or 5 to start with. And that gives us a nice billowy smoke. So Let's close this palette down just a smidge. We'll close down our smoke layer, turn our shy layers back on again. We'll unsolo our smoke layer. So now we have our train in place. And selecting radio waves, let me move our smoke layer to the smokestack where it belongs. And let's generate a quick RAM preview and see what our smoke looks like in this scene. You know, it's not a photorealistic scene, but boy, that's pretty good looking smoke, particularly for a particle system that's designed to generate concentric circles. That looks like nice, billowy smoke. You can tweak this if you like. You can make it look more realistic. You could randomize the spin value a little bit to create a little less regular tumbling. You could add a displacement map if you wanted to get the smoke to go with the wind of the train. You could displace things a little bit easily enough. There's a lot of ways you can tweak this effect, but radio wave is capable of a whole lot more than just generating concentric circles from an effect point. I urge you to play with this plugin, dig into it, do wonderful creative things with it, because it's really one of the most fun plugins you'll find in all of After Effects.